beautiful people, and welcome to season 2 of Sessions with Koren. Last season, we dove into so many topics that have an impact on our lives, and this season will be no different. We will explore the issues that we deal with on a regular basis. Today's topic is not an easy one, but it's necessary: childhood trauma. How does it show up in our adult lives? How does it shape our relationships, our careers, and our sense of self? My guest today is Jamion. He's a psychotherapist, a trauma recovery coach, and he's so passionate about mental health. He's someone who understands the emotional and psychological layers of trauma from both a personal and professional lens. If you or someone you love has ever felt stuck in a pain you can't quite explain, this episode is for you. We're going to unpack what childhood trauma really is and how we can begin to heal. Stay with us and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Sessions with Koren. With me in studio now is Jamion, trauma recovery coach and founder of the Mental Fitness Center. Jamion joins us to talk about childhood trauma and how it can follow us throughout our lives. Jamion, thank you for being here and welcome to Sessions with Koren.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to know that you are touching on such a very important topic.
Okay, great. So let's jump right into it. How would you define childhood trauma in a way that the everyday person can understand?
It's a good way to start out the conversation, and I want to start out by saying that there are many different definitions for childhood trauma. But in layman's terms, childhood trauma is basically those experiences that we have as children that can have an overwhelming sort of impact on our emotional well-being. When we talk about childhood trauma, we often focus on sexual abuse or domestic. Because to sleep after a traumatic incident is your brain is basically keeping you alert. Your brain is basically telling you the thing that happened to you before, it may happen again. So you need to be ready to run. And that is why persons may find themselves sleeping for 2 hours or 3 hours, or they may find themselves in a situation where they are basically basically any small sound wakes them up.
Trigger, yes.
Right?
Yes.
So these are some things that people may want to take into consideration. There's something else that we must look at, and that is not everything is obvious to us.
Yes.
And sometimes we're being impacted by something our friends notice, but we don't.
Yes.
And so, for example, you may be losing weight, you may be putting on weight, you may be shouting at your kids all the time, but you don't know. I had a conversation with someone a few years ago, and they said to me, Jamion, I found myself getting angry all the time, and they did not recognize it until their 4-year-old son said, Mommy, you're always angry.
Oh my.
She did not recognize that before.
Yes.
And so when we look at trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, when we are looking at the possibility of maybe evaluating whether we have been impacted by childhood trauma, it is important to have conversations with those around us.
Yes, absolutely. Right? We need that feedback.
And that sort of feedback is very important for your sessions with your psychiatrist or your psychologist, because when they're ready to make a diagnosis, they need to have that feedback.
Yes.
They need to know what your family is experiencing. One of the things that's associated with childhood trauma is borderline personality disorder, which is something that affects maybe 5% of the world's population. And I have friends with borderline personality disorder, which is a very, very difficult condition to deal with. And they didn't know that their mood was just switching from 0 to 100 in like 2 seconds.
Imagine that.
They didn't notice. And some people may say, I've been like that. I've always been moody. So it is important to be aware of subtle changes, take note of them. I'm a big fan of journaling. it's important to have a book where you're putting your thoughts
Of
in every
course.
day. And that is going to help you to identify trends. And for those persons who are triggered by specific smells or sounds, when you start journaling, you start to realize, oh, I recognize that I only get angry when this person comes in.
Patterns. The patterns.
So that sort of work, that journaling process is extremely useful in this process.
Okay, that's very, very helpful. But seeing that you touched on the journaling, let me ask you, for our viewers who may have had childhood experiences of trauma, what are some healthy ways in which they can start to shift or cope with what has happened to them?
I think one of the most important things is to recognize that there is something that needs to be addressed. That's the first step, because not everyone is willing and or ready to start that journey. And you know, it's not necessarily a pain-free journey in the sense that you have spent the last 20, 30, 40 years avoiding thinking about something that happened when you were a child.
Yes.
When you step into a therapy room and you begin that process of no longer hiding, of beginning to speak about that thing that you never wanted to speak about, that can be a very uncomfortable experience.
Yes.
And it is important to be aware of the fact that it can be a very uncomfortable experience, and it's important that you are ready for that process. In terms of coping with the trauma, I think one of the first things to do is journaling, which is a very good exercise. Finding ways of expressing your hurt, expressing your emotions. Psychotherapy is one option, but it is not the only option. Some people find support through ChatGPT. Some people find support through watching or listening to podcasts. There are many ways that you can see your experiences being reflected in the experiences of other people. Other ways may be dancing, singing, getting out that emotion. And I know people who have had traumatic experiences, but they cannot find the words to describe what they have been through, or it's just too painful to use words. And so in those instances, I've advised them to use art.
Yes.
I've advised them to use anything artistic.
Yes.
I remember having one particular client a long time ago who was suffering from a particular medical condition, and every time she tried to speak about it, you would see the veins popping up on her neck and her face turned red.
Yeah.
And I said to her, do you want to draw about your experience? She said yes. And she drew a hand covered with a barbed wire to explain how hard it was for her to speak about it. And for those persons who have had traumatic experiences, who find it difficult to verbalize the experiences, to use words, sometimes drawing can give you a sense of relief.
Jamion, what would you say to someone who said, look, that's all in the past, I want to forget about it, but they're still showing emotional and behavioral issues that say that the trauma is still very much alive in them?
I mean, my first response would be that, you know, I could understand how difficult it is to accept what has occurred. I could understand how difficult it is to accept that you were deceived by someone who you trusted. I could understand how you feel as though those around you perhaps disappoint you, that they weren't there for you, they didn't protect you. And I could understand that starting that process can be very painful. But at the same time, you know, I want that person to live their best lives. No one wants to have insomnia. Nobody wants to scream at their kids.
Yes.
Because that creates more conflict. You're screaming at them, they're screaming at you. And so what I would suggest to them is, it's a process. It's a process. It may be in the past, but the past sometimes is like a shadow. It always follows us. And one of the funny things about trauma and traumatic events is that the impacts are not always obvious to us.
Yes.
So you may be beating your kids every day and you don't recognize that it's because you are angry. It's because you are traumatized. You may be having, for example, a difficult relationship with your boss, and not realize that the reason you're always arguing with your boss is because your boss is just like your father.
Transparency, yes.
Just like your father. You didn't realize that then.
Yes.
And you hated your father and you hate your boss with the same passion. And that is why it's important to, to speak to a therapist. Going to a therapist doesn't mean something's wrong with you. It means you want to see how best you can improve your life.
Of course.
And by having that conversation, you may be able to pick up on things like, oh, that's why I'm angry. The other thing about something being in the past is when you're going to psychotherapy, things come up that may not have been obvious to you before.
Yes.
And if you want to be well, if you want to live the life that you deserve, I'd urge you to speak to psychotherapists or look at other options such as journaling. Church can be equally important, Bible study can be equally important, but I would encourage them to start the process and to keep the process going.
Absolutely. I love that answer because unresolved trauma not only affects you, but it affects everybody around you sometimes, and even relationships. 4, 5, 6, 7 relationships in a row, you're having the same issues because of those unresolved.
All the issues that we're touching on today could be addressed across a 20-hour program because there's so many issues. And you raised the point about relationships. There are persons who had traumatic experiences, and they were, for example, always trying to please their parents, and that transfers into the relationship where the same patterns have been replicated, where they basically are trying their best to please the partner, even though the partner is abusive. And so there's so many things, and I think the sooner you can start to address these issues, the easier it becomes for you and your family.
In the Caribbean region, sometimes we don't talk a lot about emotions, and there are cultural factors that we also have to unpack. How do men and women deal with trauma differently?
A very good question. I think that, of course, is looked at through the cultural lens. I think very often men are socialized to be manly. They're socialized to basically suck it up. They're socialized to not just show vulnerability. And so a man is perhaps less likely than a woman, for example, to seek psychotherapy. And it's something that's borne out in the statistics. You look at statistics related to sexual abuse. There's some studies which show that on average, a man waits between 16 and 20 years to share his experience of sexual abuse for the first time with anybody. A woman is more likely to share that with a friend. And so you can see how these cultural norms, the way that we're socialized, influence how and when we share. The other thing is a lot of men don't want to appear to be weak. And so for some people, to be vulnerable is to be weak. To cry is to be weak. And I saw that when I worked in the UK with men with prostate cancer. And most of them said to me, Jamion, when I came into these sessions, I decided I was not going to cry. Not going to cry. They ended up crying because of the nature of the sessions. So that is something I think that we have to take into consideration when we are developing mental health programs, the need to reach out to men who are very hesitant to seek support. Okay,
I understand that. And given the prohibitive cost sometimes of psychotherapy, persons can heal on their own, or is professional help absolutely necessary?
I think the healing process can be very long and it can be complex. When we look at childhood trauma, there are many emotions that have to be addressed. For example, guilt, shame, self-doubt, low self-esteem, there's anger. So there are some things you may be able to deal with on your own. For example, managing anger, maybe building your self-esteem. But one of the reasons why a psychotherapy session is so important is that you may believe that you only had 2 specific experiences. And when you begin to speak with that psychotherapist, you realize there are actually more. And I spoke to this man last year who said to me that one of the reasons that he doesn't want to go into psychotherapy is that when you start to talk you realize there are more things we need to talk about.
Absolutely. From a psychotherapist's point of
Yes,
view,
yes.
Jamion, people come into sessions and they say, I'm coming for one thing.
Yes.
And when you start asking questions and probing and you
Yes.
get more information,
Yes.
you realize sometimes
Something else.
it's a whole barrage of things they've been carrying.
Yes.
And sometimes you wonder, how is somebody making out for so long in this manner? You know,
I think a lot of people are pushing through.
pushing through.
I think a lot of people who have been carrying this trauma for years and decades, they've been accustomed to it.
But that sounds more like survival rather than thrive.
Yes.
You know, it sounds like
Yes.
we're in survival mode.
Because a lot of people, Koren, people are tired.
People are tired.
People are exhausted. And some people are just not ready to start the process. And you have a lot going on in your life.
Yes.
Some people are just not ready to start a conversation that may take them to a place of emotional vulnerability. So I can understand why many people are just not ready to start that journey.
I do understand that too, but we want to break certain cycles.
Yes.
So what can parents do as it relates to generational issues that keep recurring and recurring? What can parents do to break that cycle?
So sometimes, in the past few months, I've had parents come up to me and they've said to me, Jamion, I have a 15-year-old son. He has anger problems. I need you to speak to him. And I would often say that, sometimes parents believe the teenagers are the problem, and the teenagers believe their parents are the problem. So when you are approaching, for example, psychotherapy, it's more important to say to your son, let us seek psychotherapy as opposed to you seek psychotherapy. Because when you start pointing fingers, you may push that person away.
And it feels like blame.
It feels like blame.
And we sounds like support.
Yes. And it shows that, we are in this together. In terms of intergenerational trauma, the most important thing are the family conversations. The family conversations are key. And I want to use an example, something that I experienced a few years ago. So I was watching a movie a few years ago, and there was a particular scene in that movie. It was a violent scene.
Okay.
And I remember just starting to shake. I was shaking and crying. And at that time, I wasn't too sure why it was happening, but at the same time, I knew why it was happening. And I called a friend and I said to a friend, is this something that I experienced? And he said, no, it's something you saw.
Oh, okay.
Something you saw, because he was there. And that ties back to what you said earlier, your question earlier about the signs. Sometimes the signs are not obvious. And sometimes the impacts of that trauma is hidden.
Yes.
And sometimes we're just triggered by these random experiences. And so that is why it's important for families to have the conversations. Have conversations about, this is what happened to you when you were 6, this is what happened to you when you were 12. And that will allow the person to be in a position to determine if they need to get psychological support.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that to break the cycle,
Yes.
we have to break the silence.
Yes.
We can't push it under the carpet anymore. Okay, for those who are viewing or listening, who've been traumatized in the past for whatever reason, or from hearing your conversation, they realize, wait, this is why I've been behaving like this. This is why my mom or my child behaves like this. What words of hope or encouragement can you leave them with?
A lot of people are struggling.
Yes.
A lot of people are going through things that maybe they don't understand. But what I know for sure is everybody wants to thrive.
Yes.
We want to live our best lives. And the person listening to this program who are having problems with insomnia, they can't sleep, maybe they're having problems with addiction because they just can't, they don't want to think about the past. And what I want to say to them is, I know that that process is hard. And whenever you are ready to start that process, there is a team of mental health professionals in Antigua who are in a position to assist. And, take your time. When you are ready to address that childhood experience head on, you can reach out to one of us and start that process.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jamion. Your answers have been very, very helpful. You've given a good start in terms of the journaling,
Yes.
in terms of the finding professional help, in terms of asking persons around you, how do I behave when I'm angry, frustrated? What have you noticed more about me? You've given us enough to start with, and I'm really, really grateful for this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
More on Sessions with Koren after this break. Overcoming childhood trauma is no easy feat, but healing is possible. Whether it's the pain of what was done or the absence of what should have been, many carry invisible wounds from childhood well into adulthood. Healing takes time, intentional effort, and often professional support. Trauma isn't always about what happened. Sometimes it's about what didn't. And you can't heal what you won't acknowledge. Triggers are teachers. Pay attention to what sets you off. It's usually pointing to something deeper. You're not crazy. You're responding to unresolved pain. Healing is not a straight line, but every step forward counts. Welcome back to Sessions with Koren. Time now for your golden nugget. You may not have been responsible for your trauma, but you are responsible for your healing. That's all for this episode of Sessions with Koren. If something resonated with you, don't let it stay in your heart. Talk about it, journal about it, or reach out for help. Remember, healing is possible and you are never alone. Catch up on past episodes of Sessions with Koren on YouTube and join us next week for another powerful conversation. Until then, stay grounded, stay growing, and stay you. See you next time.